Started here. Glad you guys are all here. We're going to be talking about building a Drupal 8 theme with newfangled awesomeness. So by newfangled, I mean new things in Drupal 8 and also newer front-end techniques. So we're going to be kind of given the 1,000-foot view rather than digging deep into every line of code that's going into it. Otherwise, I'd like to call this as theme or group therapy. So we're all going to feel better and be happier and less anxious and leave here excited about the world. So that's our goal. All right, well, there we go, now it's working. All right, so I'm Mark. My name is Mark. That's my kid. That's Izzy. That's 6 months ago, so she's larger than that now. I'm here from Minnesota. I'm up in the Twin Cities. I work for the city of Minnetonka. I do web and graphic design for them. I've been working with Drupal about 6 years, and I started getting more involved about a year ago with contributing back to Drupal with Drupal 8. And so I like front-end development and working with, kind of have to wear the jack of all trades, working with a lot of different things. But I like front-end. I like making great HTML and CSS and beautiful-looking sites that are easy to use. And so themes are a big part of making that happen. I am writing a book. I'm writing a book with Pact Publishing on Drupal 8 responsive web design. Hopefully we'll be out around the end of the year. And there are some late nights. I don't really use candles, but it seemed like an appropriate way to say it. That's where my late nights are, is working on that. So, surprise, there's new things that are in Drupal 8, as well as in front end in general. There's new things, and new things can make you feel anxious sometimes because you're like, I want to know this. And personally, I get really overwhelmed by all of this. Like, I kind of wanted to talk about this because around a year ago or so, I felt like everything had changed in making websites with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and there's all these new words, and I don't know them, and I just feel like I don't even know what these things mean. So, here's group therapy. If there's one thing on that list that either you don't recognize the word, or you're not familiar, you don't really know what it does, raise your hand, okay? Right? Yeah, okay, that's pretty much everybody. Now, I'm not going to ask you how many you know or anything like that, because that's not the point. The point is, there's always going to be things that you don't feel comfortable with, and you don't feel like you know. And what my goal is that we're just going to talk through some of this stuff. We're going to talk through and say, here's the one-sentence version of what Selenium is and what it does. Because for me, when I started doing that and started figuring out, here's what this thing is, then I could figure out, here's what I want to learn more about. Here's what I want to investigate further and try out in a project. And I'm hoping that'll be useful for us to go through that together. So let's start with talking about themes in Drupal. What's a theme? Now, I think we think of a theme as here's what makes my site look nice, right? Here's how I bring it all together and give it a nice appearance. And that's definitely something that a theme does. I think that within Drupal is like you're playing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and they ask you, is that your final answer? And that's your theme. There's a lot of thing that goes into making up the output of your Drupal site to the world. The HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript. Drupal core has a lot of input on what goes into that. Modules that you download have input on that. If you're using a base theme, that has input on that. But your personal theme, the one that you have enabled, that's the one that gets the final answer on a lot of these different things. you can say, I don't want that CSS, I don't want that JavaScript, I want my own, or I want to override this markup. You get to have the final answer. And so that's what I think about when I think about what a theme is in Drupal 8. So, Drupal 8, what makes a Drupal 8 theme different? So, I think we're all familiar with having PHP in Drupal themes, right? So one of the things that's new to Drupal 8 is YAML files, which I think YAML is a kind of fun word to say. Like I'm excited that we could use it. It's kind of a more fun word than tipple-fips, you know, personally. But it is fun. It's debatable. So YAML files are typically used for configuration in Drupal 8. And they're super easy. Like, you look at it the first time and you're like, okay, I totally get how this works. It's really nice. And they're still PHP files, but you're not going to have to work as directly with PHP in your templates and knowing PHP to be able to change the markup in your site. There are definitely times where that can be handy, and you can do some neat things if you know PHP. But I think it's really great that with Drupal 8, it's a easier entrance for people who know markup, and they know how to make HTML and CSS and have to do wonderful things, but they don't necessarily want to get involved with PHP as much. So, here's the base thing when we're setting up a theme within Drupal 8 is, if you're worked with Drupal 7, you know a .info file, right? Well, in Drupal 8, it's .info.yaml. So not that different. So you have your theme name, .info.yaml. And this is what YAML looks like. I don't think that's very scary. It's just a key value system, right? So the very first line there, we have name atomic. So that's the name of the theme. There's a key, there's a colon, and then there's a value. And it's just, you don't have to deal with semicolons, you don't have to deal with a lot of brackets or stuff. It's just a very simple text file that you can use for configuration. So info files in Drupal 8, you can define your regions here like you can within Drupal 7. There's certain settings files. We'll get into some stuff that's kind of still changing. Style sheets are there for right now, but possibly not for much longer. And so that's kind of where you set up the basic things about your theme. If you have some custom settings that you want for your theme, then this is the same as Drupal 7. There's a file called theme-settings.php. And what this does, this type's really small, just don't worry about it too much. This is altering the form for your theme's appearance page. When you go to your appearance page and there's different settings there, if you want to add a new setting, a different setting, you use this file to do it. So here I'm setting up a field set and a field so that you can set, has anybody used Typekit to put fonts on their website, right? So you need a special ID. So this is this is being used for. Then there's some configuration files that can go with your theme. There's a theme.settings.yaml, and this can set some defaults for your theme. So this is an example of setting a default for that. And right now it's a little bit of a confusing situation because you can set your defaults in your info YAML file as well as in your settings.yaml file, which I think overrides the info YAML file. So that's kind of still being worked out, some of these details. But I'm just kind of sharing this so that you can just sort of have an idea of what are some of the things you might run into. And I'm just showing some like nice, beautiful pictures because I want you to feel calm. And just relax. Like, it's going to be okay, right? We're going to learn this together, and it's going to be all right. And then there's a schema YAML file that's a configuration file. And that's saying, here's the different information about a particular setting that you want to have in your theme. So that's what that is. And then there can be some other configuration files, some default installation files. This is one for breakpoints. If anybody was in the last session on breakpoints, this might be changing. I just wanted some example. The YAML files, you can put lots of YAML files in there for configuration. And so you could put in like a YAML file that defines an image style, for example, that can be used in your theme. The trick is that these are only read in when you install your theme. If you disable your theme and re-enable your theme, that's not going to make any difference in terms of if you make a change here. It's only when you install a theme does this stuff matter. But if you're shipping like a contributed theme, or shipping a theme to a bunch of different sites, and you want to set up some defaults, it's a useful way to do that. So that's all the Drupal-y stuff about setting up a theme. But the bulk of the work that you're going to be doing in your theme, a lot of it is dealing more directly with the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript. There's one more Drupal-y thing that we'll talk about, but a couple more. But anyways, so let's talk about how we actually work with the HTML and CSS and JavaScript with our theme. So one of the jobs that our theme has is to, again, have the final say on how we've got all this great data in our Drupal site, and we need to turn that into HTML that goes out to the world in markup. So Drupal has some defaults on how that works, and if you want to change that, if you want to have an impact on what variables get sent to your templates, or you want to tweak it a little bit, if you're doing a lot, that's probably a job for a module, but some minor tweaks go in this file. It's called theme.theme. And that's basically what template.php was in Drupal 7. So that's where you put all your pre-process functions and that sort of thing. And they're very similar. There's some minor differences, but this probably looks pretty familiar if you've worked with a pre-process function for Drupal 7. So this particular pre-process function might go away, but I'm doing something that will add in a typekit script to the top of the head of this theme. So, maybe not the best example, but it's an example of how you can do something to add something to your site. A lot of what you'll use it for is for coming up with theme suggestions for if you want to add some new templates and you want to make sure that Drupal picks those up. It can be used for that, or if you want to change which variables get sent to your templates. That's another really good use for this file. So now let's get to the fun stuff. This is like, because now we're getting into Twig, right? And so that's all the like PHP and configuration, and we won't have to worry about that so much anymore. So let's talk a little bit about Twig. There's no scary PHP here, right? This is a Twig file. This is a Twig template file for the HTML template. And you just have these little curly brackets, and they're nice and friendly, and then you have just like a little variable name. And you can drill down into a variable with this little dot syntax, like page.content, for example. And I don't have an example here, but you can have conditional things, like there's if statements that you can use to make decisions about which type of markup that you're going to use within your template based on a specific variable. And the goal is really to get all of the markup for Drupal into templates like this, into Twig templates. And hopefully make it really easy for you to go in and make changes. You won't have to worry about is something in a theme function. There's the theme functions and stuff to templates, right? So there's no putting markup in theme functions, hopefully, if we get all the work done. And it should hopefully be a lot easier. So hopefully it'll be easier for you to work with markup and HTML in Drupal 8. So is this making sense so far? Cool. All right. So this is not in Drupal 8 necessarily, but this is something that you might run into as you're working with some front-end stuff. So these are some other templating tools out there. Handlebars and Mustache are pretty similar to Twig. Web components is kind of a bigger thing than just HTML templating, but it's a really important thing that's probably going to change a lot of the way that we work on the web. But it's basically a way for you to define your own HTML elements that have their own bundled set of CSS and JavaScript that are tied to a template for an HTML element that you can use on your site. And it's not quite ready for prime time yet, but it's going to be a really kind of big deal when it gets full browser support and is heavily supported and that sort of thing. Haml is, how many people are familiar with Sass? Right? Almost everybody. Haml is like a pre-processing language for HTML. So it lets you write a shortened version, just a terse syntax that creates HTML. I haven't personally run into a lot of stuff that makes use of it. It's a Ruby-based thing, but you might hear the term. I thought, hey, might be handy to know what that is. So now let's talk about CSS and JavaScript and how you get that hooked up to your Drupal theme. So this is going to be a really important file, and this is kind of new. It's theme.libraries.yaml. And this file is how, this really should probably be the main way that you're attaching CSS and JavaScript to your theme's markup. And one of the things this does really well is that it handles dependencies. So by default, Drupal 8 doesn't have any JavaScript that's being output, unless you're using something that specifically needs to make use of it. And so jQuery, for example, is not included on every page of your site. But what you can do is say, I want to use something that depends upon jQuery, and then you put that dependency information into this file, and then that will get triggered. jQuery will get automatically pulled in. And you can also declare dependencies for CSS here, and so this will probably, I think there's a couple things left to do, but this is probably going to replace putting your CSS and JavaScript in your info.yaml file. And on the internal side of things, there's this library called Aesthetic that is in Drupal 8 right now, but it basically provides a lot of functions for working with CSS and JavaScript and will let you do cool things. It's not being fully utilized right now. There needs to be some more work done to make that happen and actually get it useful before we launch Drupal 8, but it should provide some useful stuff. Aesthetic. Okay, so let's go a little bit more into JavaScript. Who here likes JavaScript? Okay, there's a few of us. I'm not raising my hand. I use it some, but I'm more of a CSS person. But it does its stuff. You need it, right? So JavaScript tools. So these are, Modernizer is something that's baked into Drupal 8 core, and it's really useful if you're doing some theming. So what Modernizer does is it's a feature detection library. So it says, let's say that you want to use some CSS feature that not every browser will have. So Modernizer will detect whether or not the browser that the user is using has that feature, and if it does, it'll write a class into the HTML element and say, like, has flexbox, for example, or no flexbox. I'm not sure don't write that as code because that's not right. But it puts in a class, and then in your CSS, then you can have that saying, I have this CSS if that class is there, and that way, and a different CSS if not. So then it's not browser detection, it's not device detection, but it's feature detection, which is a good thing. So you might not always need to use that, but it's there and it's baked in. Underscore. So my understanding of underscores is kind of a JavaScript library that provides some useful additional functions for JavaScript. Has anybody used underscore? No. Okay, well then you're going to, oh wait, is that right? Was I right on that? Yeah. Okay, cool. Yay. All right, I feel good. Cool. CoffeeScript. CoffeeScript is, it's like Haml and Sass. It's a preprocessor, so you can write a more terse version of JavaScript without all the semicolons and stuff like that. And I've seen that kind of bandied about a little bit. Not necessarily built into Drupal 8, but something you might run into because as you're incorporating different things into your theme. And then these are kind of the big three that I see talked about a lot. These are MVC JavaScript frameworks, Model View Controller, that provide, much more, I don't know, does anybody use any of these? Yeah. So how would you describe it?
MVC for JavaScript.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so it provides a way to set up a structured way for you to have your JavaScript rather than it being one giant mess. Right? So Backbone, and Ember, Angular. Angular is backed by Google, right? Backbone is built into Drupal 8, and we're using it for like the navigation toolbar. So that's there and can be used. The other ones are not baked in, but you can pull them in. And then if you're doing structured JavaScript, a module-based system for JavaScript, I just kind of ran into, these are some things you might run into. AMD and CommonJS are load modules for JavaScript, and they use a loader, require.js, and curl.js. Has anybody used that stuff? No, I haven't, but I thought, I've seen require.js, so I've seen that mentioned, and I thought, let's share that in case you see that term. You might have some sense of what that does. All right, now the fun stuff. CSS for fun and profit, right? We got a little cat bear thing on a beach, so it's got to be fun. All right, so I think a lot of people are shifting to writing Sass and Compass, Sass in particular, and probably Compass, rather than straight CSS. How many people have used that so far? Right? Okay, so this is probably going to be pretty familiar, but if not, if you see a theme, there's lots of themes now that ship with Compass support. So one of the files you'll see is a config.rb file. And this is just a configuration file. It's kind of like info YAML for Compass. It sets, here's some basic defaults for Compass that you're going to use. So that might be something you run into. One other thing that's kind of important, and will be getting used in Drupal 8, CSS architecture. So SMACS stands for Scalable and Module Architecture for CSS. I think I got that right. And it's basically a way for structuring your CSS. Instead of having one big CSS file, breaking things up and setting up different rules for your base, just element styles, for your layout, rules for components, items like a search box, your styles for like a search box, for like hover states, that sort of thing. So doing things in a more structured way, and also kind of related to that, principles of object-oriented CSS, which is saying, I've certainly in the past, I just write out a bunch of elements if I'm going to do a CSS selector, right? And there's a lot of problems with that you run into with specificity. And what OOCSS talks about is you're using a lot of classes that are saying, I've got a class and I'm going to target my styles to that class rather than to an HTML element. And most stuff ends up getting a class on it because it gives you a lot more flexibility and consistency, and you have to fight with specificity a lot less. So, and BEM, block element modifier, is kind of a syntax for how you define your class names. And these things are important because Drupal 8 is using this sort of style of things for how it structures its own CSS. One of the things that we're working on right now, we're trying to clean up all the markup in Drupal 8, which is hopefully going to be really good. And we're looking at doing the work to have two different approaches so that the core modules by default really won't have any classes in them. If you want to start from scratch and have nothing to start with and then just add in what you need, you can do that. And then we're also going to have a base theme in Drupal 8 that has a sensible system of classes and structure for the HTML so that you can use the CSS architecture to target your styles and hopefully work with it in a sensible way. And then other themes can use that as a base for their theme. So other things that you'll run into in the front-end world, Bootstrap and Foundation. I would guess most people here have heard of Bootstrap, right? So, and Web Starter Kit is the new kid on the block. Web Starter Kit is a Google thing. Bootstrap is from Twitter. Foundation is from Zerb. And these are basically kind of like a kitchen sink of here's a whole bunch of CSS and classes that you can use to, if you just apply this class to this element, you will change its appearance in this way. And a lot of people find it really easy because they don't have to go through a lot of work to set up all of these different classes. There's some drawbacks to this approach. You might not end up needing all of this, and then you have a really large set of CSS files that you're pulling in, and you're using only a small subset of it. I also have some concerns. I'm really big on responsive design, and I think some of the defaults for how Foundation and Bootstrap work aren't always the best. So they have a limited set of breakpoints based around device sizes, and you're applying, when you're setting up a grid for your layout, you're applying classes to elements within your design. And I think it gets kind of messy and isn't necessarily very sustainable. You can do it not that way, but a better way within Bootstrap and Foundation, but it takes a little bit more work. But you're going to run into a lot if you're working with stuff. And so, yeah. If you're building your own thing from scratch, and there's a lot of themes in Drupal 7 that are already doing this. So Omega, Zen, Aurora are themes that are kind of giving you a framework for building out a responsive design. You're probably going to run into Zen grids, Suzy, and Singularity are 3 different CSS grid frameworks for easily setting up your layout. And those are good. They're all float-based layout systems. So I think another thing to keep your eye on is there's new kids on the block for CSS layout. So Flexbox and regions and grids are 3 new ways of handling layout within CSS. And Flexbox in particular has a lot of browser support right now. And really, you're pretty much at the point where you can start using it in production sites. And like how many people have ever struggled with equal heights on floats, right? And how horrible that is. Flexbox helps you take care of that and do it in a sensible way. Floats were never meant to be used for layout. It's a hack that we've used, and these are some better things that are coming on. So I think watch this space, because even though Zen grids and Suzy and Singularity are really cool, the layout model that we're using might change. Some other tools that you might run into when you're working with Sass. These are some that I found useful, but gems, compass gems that you install. Breakpoint is a great one for managing the media queries that you're using in a responsive site. Toolkit has a lot of little functions that you can use that are handy for responsive design. Modular scale helps you set up some sensible typography. Color Schemer helps you set up sensible color schemes. Surprising given the name. Sassy Buttons lets you make fancy looking buttons. So shocking, right? But they're pretty, all of these tools are out there, and you don't necessarily need to know every one of them, but it's helpful to know that they exist and try them out in your next project. So if you're working with all this, so tools, this is, confession, I used Dreamweaver for a number of years. How many people will use Dreamweaver for a number of years? It's okay.
Proud to say it.
Right, okay. So I'm a new convert to the command line, and it's not as scary as I thought it would be, right? So if you're doing some of these things, you're working with Sass, there's ways to do them with a graphical user interface, but command line is, you're eventually going to be probably getting to there. So command line and using Git for your version control. There's a lot of projects that you probably want to pull into your site with Git. And Drush. Who's here to use Drush? Yeah, pretty much everybody, right? So one important thing to know, Drush, rather than downloading it from a website, you're going to use Composer to pull Drush into your machine. We'll talk about what Composer is in just a second. So, we've got leaning goats. How could this go wrong, right? So we're going to talk about dependencies and package management and how one project might lean on another project like a goat.
Nice.
All right, so in PHP, there's different tools that help with this. So in PHP, the tool is Composer. And there used to be a thing called pair, which people had a lot of troubles with, and Composer is so much easier and more wonderful to use. And what it is it says, hey, I want to use these certain things, like drush. And you'll have a little file called composer.json. And Drupal 8 uses this. You're probably not going to use this as much in your theme itself, but good to know it's out there and what it does. So Composer says, okay, I want to use these different PHP projects or packages of files and pull them in. And then those are all registered with a website called Packagist. And when it does that, it doesn't just pull down the things that you need. It'll check to see what dependencies there are and see, what are the different things that I also need if I want to run those things. And we'll handle taking care of all of that, which is really handy. And so we have a number of things like that that we're going to mention here briefly. So if you have front-end things, Bower is a very similar tool for like CSS and JavaScript libraries that you might want to pull into your theme. For example, I was trying out this one called Formalizer, which was a collection of CSS and JavaScript that helps to ensure consistent display of form elements across browsers. And so you can have a little file called bower.json and say, all right, I want to use formalize in my system. And you could also declare there, it requires jQuery. So you could put that in there. And basically, although you probably want to do that in your libraries.yaml file. Any case, point being that you can say what it depends on, and Bower can take care of pulling things in, or you don't. It'll take care of pulling things in. All right. There we go. That's the explanation for what Bower is. Okay. For Node, Node.js is JavaScript on your server or your local machine to do little chunks of things, right? So Node has a thing to install little packages of stuff too. And it's npm, Node Package Manager. And again, you have a little file called package.json. And I should say that when you're going to use this, so let's say that there's a package.json file in your theme. And you're like, okay, what do I do with that? So on your command line, all you need to do is type npm install. And that will take care of, that's what will trigger it to use that file and say, okay, you want to use these Node packages, and I know that they have these dependencies. npm in particular, if you ever really want to feel like you're in the matrix, I say use npm, because it really like has all kinds of lines. It's much more wordy than almost anything else. And it'll pull things in. For Bower, you type Bower install. For Composer, it's Composer install. And it's a pretty simple way, rather than you going out and trying to find all of these things and downloading them and finding the right versions yourself. And that's also what's important, is it takes care of, you can specify which version works with the stuff that you've developed. And Ruby has a similar thing. So those Ruby gems we talked about. Bundler is what can take care of managing the right versions and pulling in any dependencies. And you have a file called gem file. And if you want to install it, you type bundle install. And then it will write all of the things that it actually downloaded to gemfile.lock. And then another thing that you probably want to use if you're using Bundler is, in theory, a gem could require a specific version of Ruby that you do not have installed. And so RVM takes care of, if you really need a specific version of the Ruby programming language on your machine, it will take care of installing that specific version while not screwing things up for every other project that you're working on. And that's really one of the important things here, is that instead of installing things globally on your machine, you're tying it to your specific project so that you can have multiple versions of some of these tools on your machine and keep things consistent per project. Okay, so if you're getting into setting up your development environment, probably a lot of us have used MAMP or WAMP or LAMP or XAMPP at some time, setting up a local server on our machines, right? Acquia Dev Desktop is a way to do that in a way that's focused on setting things up in a way that's friendly to Drupal. And sometimes I found those to be a little bit slow. I got convinced to set up using Homebrew on my Mac to install a lot of the PHP and versions and things that would work nicely. So that's a tool. But I see a lot of talk these days about like Vagrant and Docker, which set up a virtual environment with your local development environment. And my understanding is like Chef and Puppet can be used to set up the instructions for how those get configured. And that way you can have a virtual environment with the same set of instructions for how it gets set up as on your production server, so that you can have consistency between the two places, and you know that the way that you're doing it on your local machine works the same way as working on your production machine. Make sense? Cool. Here's another tool that I found that's being used in a couple themes that I think is pretty neat. It's called Yeoman. It's a node-based tool. And what Yeoman does is a scaffolding tool. So how many people have used Zen theme? Right? And there's a starter kit folder, right? And you copy the starter kit, and then you have to go through and find everywhere in the theme where you have to change it to the name of the sub-theme that you want and manually copy and paste. And if you get it wrong someplace, there could be problems, right? Well, what Yeoman does is it says, here's the set of things that we're going to use to build a sub-theme. You tell me the name of your sub-theme. I will build out all the files, and I will put in all of the correct function names and file names that are based on your sub-theme name. So you don't have to do that all manually, which I think is a pretty cool way to do things. So another thing that's really helpful is task runners. And so these are things that will do things for you. So you can, if you're running a bunch of command line stuff, you don't have to type 10 different commands each time you want to get things ready to load to the production server. So grunt and gulp are the two biggest ones in this space, and both of them, so you might see a theme that has gruntfile.js or gulpfile.js, and these are a set of instructions that say here are different tasks that we want to do, and all you have to do is type something like grunt watch or grunt build or even just grunt. And you type one command and it does like 10 things, and you don't have to remember to do every single thing each time you want to do it. And that's pretty handy, and I'm seeing that being used in themes. So when you have robots that do these sort of things for you, these tasks, what are some of the things you can do? So lints. Lints are finding the little bugs, like in your CSS and JavaScript, and telling you about them so that you can fix them, right? Is that pretty much? I haven't used those a lot. Okay, all right. All right, we're going to power through this. We're almost done here, so then we can party and relax. Minifiers. So Uglify.js will scoop up all of your JavaScript and get rid of all the spaces. And I think there's something similar for CSS and gets it ready for going to the server. Auto prefixer. How many people hate CSS vendor prefixes? I think those are the worst thing in the world. Only one of you? They're really bad. So Compass is one way that people have dealt with this, because Compass has some built-in tools to let you use mix-ins, so little functions that if there's a CSS property that's not used necessarily in every browser yet, it will take care of writing these vendor prefixes for CSS properties so that you can use them and they will work. But it's complicated knowing which browser versions currently are using a vendor prefix and which are not, and where you need them and what the syntax is. And in Compass, you still need to know which things you need to use that on and which you don't. Auto prefixer is a really neat tool that takes care of all of that for you. It goes out and checks this website, caniuse.com, which is a really good database of here's what works and here's what doesn't in different browsers. And it takes care of going through your CSS and finding all the things that need vendor prefixes and doing that so you don't have to do it. That sounds good to me. There's also things that can improve your images. If you've got images in your theme, imageoptim will squeeze down and suck out the extra unnecessary space and improve so that your images are smaller to download. Grunticon sets up fallbacks for SVG, which SVG is very well supported right now. Drupal 8 is using SVG. Grunticon can set up PNG files for backups for older browsers. That's one thing that it does. And you can also do other things with grunt or gulp, where you can run a shell command, or you can copy files from one place to another place. So that's kind of neat. Another thing that you run into a lot is prototyping tools. So rather than having a Photoshop file, and I know that this still happens, but the goal is we want to move to using responsive design for everything, right? And if you create a Photoshop comp for every potential version of your layout and all the different devices out there, it gets kind of crazy. So the goal is to move into building in the browser and getting some better tools so that you can focus on designing the system for your design rather than necessarily every single page layout for your site. And there's some really good tools. There's some, Style Tiles is based in Photoshop, but it's like where you can see, here's the different fonts that we're using in this design, here's the different colors, and here's some of the different elements that you'd see in the design. Element collages are a little bit more robust. Here's different bits of the site design that we want to use. Visual inventories are going through the entire site and finding, like an existing site that you're redesigning, here's the 12 different versions of buttons that exist on this. Let's narrow that down. And then there's some cool tools that help you develop a style guide, a design style guide that you can use so that you can have one place where you can see, here's how all of our different elements on our site are styled, here's the different components we're using. And style prototypes is one tool that can do that. Pattern Lab is another one that I really like. KSS is another one. Stands for Nile Style Sheets, and you basically put some HTML snippets into your Sass documentation to create a living style guide. I'm keen on Pattern Lab. I think that's a really neat tool. I'm working on a D8 theme right now, and I built some coordination where I'm using the live production styles and pushing that into the Pattern Lab prototype with Grunt, so that as you're working on the styles, you can use this prototyping tool and see how the individual elements are looking. And I've been finding that pretty useful. So that's how some of this stuff can come together. And then you want to test things so that it definitely works before you deploy it. And so rather than going to every potential browser in the world and trying to install multiple versions of Internet Explorer, which is a special kind of hell, Browser Stack is a really nice tool to go out there and grab screenshots. Wraith and PageRes I found were some screenshot tools to get different screenshots of things. Then there's things called headless browsers, Phantom.js and Slimer.js. So these are, my understanding is these are browsers that run on the command line as part of testing tools, right? And so some of those, there's behavior-driven development, right? That BHAT is a big thing that's getting worked into Drupal 8. Casper.js, I believe, is another kind of behavior-driven testing where rather than going to every page on your website to make sure it works, it's saying, all right, machine, robot, do that and go to the set of things and make sure that it works. And that way it's done consistently rather than you remembering to do it every time you change something. Selenium is something similar to that for testing front-end elements. Again, so you don't have to test everything manually every time you make a change. And then pushing it into production, Jenkins and Travis CI are a couple tools that help to integrate everything together and test things as they're going. Is that right?
It's really more of a deployment tool.
Deployment tool, okay. So, great, thank you.
But you can run tests during deployments. So yes, it does both of those things.
Okay, cool. So, this feels like a lot of stuff that you have to know these days, right? Does anybody feel like that's a lot of stuff? Right, it feels like a lot of stuff. And, why is this happening? I was trying to think about this. Why has it become this crazy? And I think that part of the reason is because we want to have good collaboration when you have different team members and they have different setups on their computers. And you want to make sure that if one team member works on something, that it works the same as someplace else. And you want to make sure that it works consistently between your local machine and what ends up on the production server. And you also want to get some additional capabilities, like using variables in your CSS, like Sass provides. And not having to do so many mundane tasks, where you might forget to do one of them. And so this will help you find errors, improve performance before deployment. So it's a lot of stuff, but there's some good benefits. So how do you deal with this, right? Like, great, they're all good, but how do I actually deal with that in my real life and not feel like I'm going crazy? Because it's really easy. There's a good article on a list apart recently about this. One way to approach this is just find one thing that sounds useful, and in your next project, try that one thing out. I mean, if you're working on internal projects where you maybe just have one project that you're working on for a long time, that's harder to do. But, just try one thing at a time rather than trying to do 10, 15 things at a time. And I think it's just also helpful to know that we're all in this together, right? So just to kind of recap, I kind of feel like working on the web is like whitewater rafting, right? And the water's always changing, and it's rushing, and it's going. And I sort of felt like I had figured it out. And I knew how to make websites with HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And then everything just totally changed. And the raft flipped over. Right? And I'm like, what happened? And for a time there, I felt like just shouting at the river. Why? But that wasn't very helpful. It didn't make things better. And I think if I was really in a river, bad things would have happened. So the goal is, instead of shouting at the river, find something to grab onto. Or better yet, find somebody who you can grab their hand and they can help pull you up. Find a mentor. That getting involved in Drupal has helped me because I've been able to work with other people in working on Drupal 8. So come to the sprints tomorrow. Like I said, I'm working on a Drupal 8 theme. If you want to take a look at what I'm working on, I can show you a little bit more directly. And, we can collaborate a little bit. There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved, and then you don't have to feel like you're in a raft upside down. Instead, you can be like this guy. He looks really happy. I mean, the reality is there's not like a one-time thing where you have to learn all this stuff. This is going to keep happening. And so it's really hard to keep on top of it. There's no magic raft paddle. I don't wear one raft. I thought it would be a helpful analogy. But so anyways, but we can do this together, and we can feel okay. And so this is, if you want to contact me, contact me on Twitter, and contact me on IRC. I really need to consolidate those two because I have two different usernames. Should just probably all be Mark Drummond. But for right now, there's two different things. So find me on IRC. Get involved with Drupal. Help things out. And it will all be okay. Okay?